Nelson Mandela was he was this faceless terrorist. They never showed his face on TV. Then I do remember vaguely, okay, reports on the news of him dying, okay. But what struck me as odd was that Winnie Mandela was treated like royalty in South Africa. She was under house arrest or surveillance or whatever you want to call it. But when at certain times she would be put out into the public space, she was more of a face than Nelson Mandela. All right. There was a whole story that happened with her and people that she had killed that came out in the news. There were obviously all the bombings that were happening under the ANC and in the name of Nelson Mandela and Mkhonto where those things were publicized. But the things that weren't publicized were the letter bombs that were going out. No, it's going great. Good to be on the show, Daryl. Yeah, it's very good.
I'm psyched to have you here. So approximately, where are you right now?
I'm on the southern tip of Africa, Hart Bay.
Technically in the region that a lot of us call South Africa?
That's correct, South
Yeah,
Africa.
right on. How long have you lived there?
Well, I've been in Hart Bay now for 2 years. Prior to that, I was in Natal Midlands for about 6 months. And prior to that, I was in Johannesburg for about 25 years. And prior to that, I grew up in the Eastern Cape, which is the Eastern Cape province, which is an interesting part of the world. I'm sure we're going to get into that discussion.
Yeah, we will. And uh, we've talked about all kinds of things in these months leading up to the show, and we're gonna touch on some of them, or maybe all of them, because I got a lot of time for this show. But you know, I just thought about it when I was trying to plan this discussion. I was like saying, what's weird is this thing called the Mandela effect, and that's weirdness that I love to touch upon. But it came from the name Nelson Mandela. And so to start with, I figured I was going to start like just to read out what my Gemini AI gave me, which is like I didn't change this AI to give me accurate information. I just like use that one to get like what's the mainstream version of Nelson Mandela, and it spit out Nelson Mandela, 1918 to 2013, was a South African revolutionary who fought against the oppressive apartheid system. After 27 years in prison, he was released in 1990 and negotiated a peaceful transition to democracy. In 1994, he became South Africa's first black president, winning the Nobel Prize for his reconciliation efforts. So that's the PR version, and
Yeah.
I remember living through some of that. But just to start with, growing up in South Africa, did you ever hear the idea that Mandela died in prison?
Yeah, well, okay, so from a South African perspective, we were getting fed, I think we were getting fed vastly different sort of news feeds. The news was pretty much state controlled. I mean, there's degrees to that how obvious that is, but there was heavy censorship that was going on in South Africa at that time. I guess state of emergency was 79 to 1990. We never ever saw pictures of Nelson Mandela, not that I remember. I mean, I was young. I was born 1974. So at that time, South Africa was already sending troops to Angola. There was a bush war that was going on. There was a civil war happening, even though we weren't really aware of it. We weren't even really aware of a civil war. Everyone was very isolated. The society had been pretty much broken up into and separated, almost like balkanized or federalized in a sense. Different communities were located in different areas. The news was very different for us. Nelson Mandela, I remember vaguely that there was a news report that happened where I heard that he had passed away. the reason I remember it is because I remembered the kind of my family was very traditional in that sense. For them, it was kind of just another terrorist that had been killed, and kind of good riddance. You know what I mean? But there wasn't really there wasn't they didn't show pictures of it or anything like that. But it was very vague. I mean, you know, memories. They're funny things. You know, sometimes it might have been, it's almost like a dream. You know what I mean? I definitely have friends that remember that, remember it as well. Black and white friends that remember talk of him dying in prison. And
Yeah, definitely
yeah,
known as a terrorist in many aspects. And I was just about to look that one up because I remember reading, there was like this softball version that I was given growing up in, say, like, if we're talking about like 94 or so, when he, what, was allegedly put in prison or something like that. I mean, this was like some type of hero that was put out there to like, that was like protesting things. But then there, like, you look up the reality of what this guy was involved with, and there's a whole
mm,
bunch of death and mayhem that's associated around him, if not directly orchestrated by him and his wife. And that's like what I can find when I'm looking up like this guy now, thanks to internet. But back
yeah.
then, he was painted as this black savior in the same way as Obama was painted decades later.
Yeah, so the thing is, okay, so we were getting the other side of that story, okay, obviously at that time. And it's interesting that you say that because it just shows that the media was playing people against each other. He was the head of Mkhonto Sizwe. He's the only guy that he was interviewed in 1961, right? But it's connected to the BBC, obviously, and it wasn't really. I don't know if you've seen that interview, but it's not really a hardball interview. It's more sort of an advertorial for the ANC. And just prior to what had happened there, um, the ANC had pretty much, up until that point, it had kind of been disbanded in a sense. Okay. There had been a whole bunch of stuff that had led up to the ANC within that iteration, but prior to that, it had taken a break because um, it didn't fit with it didn't seem to fit with the divisive role that it could play to the social engineers, as it were. Okay.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, there was obviously social engineering going on in America because it was painting where you lived as a bunch of oppressive white settlers who had, I suppose, Dutch ancestry, and
yeah. Well,
I'm taking a guess. Yeah,
that is correct. I mean, there was racism that was going on at that time, but had been implanted. Okay, so you've got this dialectic that is put into the culture, that is injected into the culture, as it were, and that had been going on for a long time since Charles Darwin had a cousin by the name of Francis Galton. The Galton Institute still exists, right? And the Galton Institute, this was during Victorian times, right? So Francis Galton, he published his book on eugenics in 1883. The Zulu Wars were taking place in South Africa, just to put it into context, right? And then in 1886, gold was discovered. All right, and this now at that time, the where the gold had been discovered wasn't a British colony yet. All right, the Boers the fur trekkers had moved up to that part of the world, and they just wanted to get away from the British. Okay, unfortunately for them, gold got discovered where they had moved to, and of course the British wanted a way in. Okay, but this book, this writing of Francis Galton basically set up the idea of eugenics, where people were profiled according to their appearance, and it's this hierarchy and status according to race. It all goes back to the divine right of kings, or the divine right to rule. Right. This is the game they're playing, and it goes. I mean, that goes back, like we were saying earlier, it goes back all the way back to probably Göbekli Tepe, because now we're talking about the priest class and them watching the cycles of nature and using it to coerce people and to manipulate people. So what he's doing is he's writing it into the science, outcomes-based science, as it were, so that the British would have the divine right to rule over everyone, right? So creating this caste system. From that point on, you start to see this influence within South Africa, where because they had such a hard time with all the different factions or the tribes within South Africa, white, black, Bantu, Bushman, Zulu, Xhosa, Pedi, Tswana. There's 11 different languages in this place, right? So they had to figure out how they were going to divide people against each other, because when we stood together, they were not in a good place. Britain had been kicked out of South Africa twice during the Zulu Wars. I mean, more than twice. They'd basically been fighting a war of attrition around here for quite some time, because people weren't having it, okay? And it wasn't just the white people, it wasn't just the black people. They just didn't want to be colonized, all right? They wanted to hunt and grow. I'm not saying it was some kind of Shangri-La, but people just don't want to be slaves. And and a lot of people had moved here because they just didn't want to be under that sort of yoke, all right?
Yeah, and that's the history of everywhere. Like, this is a world of migration, as I try to explain to the folks who would, have these conceptions of who are the rightful people to live in a certain area. It's a twisted version of, well, the thing about it is that at this point in the world, everyone has moved everywhere, and the rightful people are the people who just happen to live there now. That's it. Period. End of story, because that's what everyone gets to do. But then there's this fictional version that people have of how peaceful things were here in the Hawaiian Islands before any Europeans showed up. It was totally awful for most women and many of the lesser castes of people living here. It was awful. And then the Europeans came, and they were like, oh, we know what to do here. We're going to take this, and we're going to import some new slaves from other places like Portugal and such. Over there, I know, like, that, there's the wave of people who were there to conquer imperially, but then there's the people who settled from the Netherlands. I'm saying potentially some of your ancestors, maybe, people who settled from other European countries, people who even came from England. It's a world of migrants, and it's a world of conflict of the people who already were there, like the people, those tribes that you mentioned. And I'm sure you can name those 11 different tribes all over again. It's not like they had peaceful relations with each other perfectly. They did not, like there's like, everywhere has a history. North America, South America, and for sure Africa and Asia. They all have this history of conflict and warfare of the local tribes living there. That's the way it was, as it was when there were tribes of Europeans living in the so-called continent of Europe, as it will always be. And this is the least violent time ever. But the only way to keep racism alive is to try to promote racism and difference. So they really did. But my idea from my growing up, New York State, and what I got to see growing up, like from there, from 1972 onwards, I got to see a lowering of all racism year by year, decade by decade, that it was only like, it's a manufactured idea that was kept alive. Did you kind of see that, where it was also racism was decreasing over the years that you have lived there, or was it changed?
Well, the thing is, you see, apartheid was an experiment, all right, and it was basically, I mean, it accelerated when I was a kid, it was pretty rampant, okay. South Africa was a stronghold in terms of that experiment, but it's not a natural way to be. No kid is born hating someone just because of the color of their skin. That is something that is implanted. It's something that's programmed. All right. I'm not saying that tribalism doesn't exist, because I mean it's had to do that in the past, but we need to evolve past that. And also, I mean, this as well. What we're fed in history, even the timeline that I'm familiar with, I have to familiarize myself with what is the accepted historical context, even though it might be total BS. We have to know what we're working with, because it's all we got right now. And the story, that's the narrative that's the fairy tale, as it were. The Nelson Mandela fairy tale, in terms of who he was, the saint or whatever, whether that be him or Margaret Thatcher, or Ronald Reagan or whatever. They're power hungry psychopaths, for the most part, by virtue of the job that they've taken. The job kind of it's a prerequisite that you have to be dead to certain things. You have to be prepared to kill or send kids off to war. So it's yeah, that definitely, the whole racist sort of culture was definitely a big part of South Africa at that time, and it was part of it. I mean, I'm not going to deny that, but
I mean, did you grow up before apartheid was actually instituted, and maybe describe
no.
exactly what apartheid
Well,
is?
yeah, exactly. So it's a branding, all right. I mean,
It's a
apartheid.
branding.
Yeah, it's a branding. It's a brand. It's the total method of mind control, and it is something that was made into a nationalist sort of movement on both sides. Both the ANC and the National Party of the time were both nationalist, like the Nazis, and 70% of this white South Africans were employed by government. So that's pretty socialist, okay? As much as they proclaim to be, a capitalist republic or whatever. It was the 70% were either employed by the railways or by Home Affairs or whatever institution it was. I mean, the post office, whatever. Everything was nationalized. But we got told something different. We got told, the red scare. We called it the Rooi Gevaar, the red terror, in South Africa, and the black people, they were told the other stories, because all these newspapers that were getting distributed around South Africa, you find that they kind of go back to the same source, and they basically pushing this wedge between the people based on color. They're using it
Yeah.
as a leverage tool. It's assimilating the culture, and then saying, "Oh, look, there's the other guy. That's the bad guy," and keeping people divided along those lines. While it makes them easily malleable as a society when people start to buy into this en masse. And that had been set up for a long time, long before the so-called apartheid government. I mean, pass laws. The British were still in control during when pass laws were around. Okay, so all the things that the apartheid government were getting blamed for were set up by the British.
Most people don't know this, that you have,
Yeah,
first of all those tribes you just mentioned, including the Zulu, and then you
yeah,
also have people who showed up there. They just wanted to make a farm. They came from the Netherlands, a lot of them, right?
yeah.
And then the British show up, totally not related to the farmers from the Netherlands, and they're actually like take control of the whole thing, the whole shebang. Is that kind of a quick version?
Well, kind of. They got handed over. So it's the white colony was kind of set up initially by the VOC, the Dutch East Indian Company, right? It was a trading port,
Ah,
because this is before the Suez Canal, all right? So this was how you got to India if you were going by sea, all right? And if how you got to the Far East, you had to go around the Cape Horn, all right? So it was an important trading post. And that was all it was meant to be. And it was a corporate endeavor because the Dutch East India Company was basically an armed company. It's kind of like what we're seeing today, where you've got monopoly capitalism. It's not laissez-faire capitalism. It's basically you've got you've got the world controlled by institutions of government and massive corporations that are the only version of free trade that you see in the world. I can't trade freely with people across in Botswana, but it's easier for these multinationals to do it because they don't operate under the same rules as people like you and I. All right. And it's the same with the VOC at that stage. All right. And there was a transitionary period where it went from that into the Batavian state, Napoleon, and all that kind of stuff. And then what happened was it kind of got handed over. But there was a lot of war that went on over here because there was a slave trade, all sorts of things going on up and down the east and west coast of Africa, and that had been going on for a long time. Stuff that we're not even told about because you've got the Muslims that who had their slave trade going on as well. And a lot of the tribes that were in South Africa at the time, they hadn't arrived that much longer, that wasn't even that they kind of everyone kind of arrived at the same time except for the Khoisan people or the Bushmen. They had been here for a long time. They're the really the only original people, and they got wiped out. They got decimated. All right, but there's still a lot of them around here. But like you were saying earlier, one has to be careful about this sort of thing because what it leads to is a divine right to rule. Okay, when we're talking about bloodlines and lineage and all that kind of stuff. And no one has the right to rule anyone else. You know, we all got the same exact human rights under the universe or God or whatever you want to call it, right? You just do unto others as you'd have done unto you and look after one another, right? That's supposed to be the way we live, right? But
That
what
would be
happens,
nice.
yeah,
But
that
what
would be
happened?
that was the ideal thing. But what happens is that you've got these stories, these fairy tales that get put into place about, chivalry, about King Arthur or whatever, all right, or the lineage of Jesus or Muhammad or whatever. And that gives people the idea that they have, because they have this lineage, that they can, that they have the right to be gangsters and force people to submit to them and pay them tribute. Okay. And that can happen, doesn't matter what color you are, whether it be Khoisan, whether it be Zulu, white, whatever. If someone can feed you that narrative and make you believe that, oh no, I'm just subordinate to that person because of their genetics, then what happens is you hand over your conscience, your common sense, your scruples,
Yeah.
to the powers that be. And it can be anyone that can do that. As long as they've got that leverage, they can do it. It's all about being able to centralize resources and say, okay, fine, well, that person's going to be the government, so they must be in charge. That means that they can steal as much as they want from me, which is a lot of crap, really.
Isn't it though? And like a lot of this stuff we're talking about is managing a narrative. And
Exactly.
you've grown up in South Africa, so they can only like pretend things are a certain way to, like against the evidence of your own eyes, and you're actually like where you actually do, live. You've lived your whole life around all of these other races, just like I did back in New York, like in the state
Yeah,
of New York, lower state. If you have a problem with people looking different and talking different languages and coming from a different culture, you're going to have a hard time. New York's a bad place for that because it's like people from everywhere are there. So you're
yeah,
going to have a really hard time. And it sounds like a similar kind of thing, like where you were, like where you are your whole life is all these people coming from all kinds of places. People like whether like the Kong Bushman, like who likes family maybe
yeah.
go back for
Quite
some
common.
time, or yeah, or just folks just emigrated there from the Netherlands, or the British Raj or rulers who like engineered the British East India Company, which by the way is where the American flag comes from. Look at
Exactly.
go ahead, by
Well,
the way,
that's
new
the
people watching. Go look up the British East India Company flag and look up the American flag, and if there are any similarities. I digress. Going back to it, Nelson
No.
Mandela.
No, to that
Yeah.
point, the British East India Company basically took over from the Dutch East India Company, right? So that's where,
Right.
so it's all companies. Okay, it's all there's a CK number to it. There's a corporation, all right, and so basically ever since that, South Africa hasn't ever really. They changed the branding, they changed the name, they changed a few details here and there, but it's still a corporation and we're still part of the Commonwealth. All right, South Africa is still part of the
Ah.
Commonwealth. So, but it's all just so the narrative kind of makes people okay with it. All right, that we're paying tribute to the Queen, as it were. All right, because all our minds are being Anglo-American is running a lot of that stuff. I mean, there's a lot of narrative in South Africa right now talking about xenophobia, all right, and about foreigners. It's the same as what's going on over there. It's a global phenomenon. Fancy that it's weird. One would think that maybe it's all being centralized. The information's centralized because it's the same story everywhere. Foreigners, um, immigrants, whatever you want to call it, refugees. So the thing is that these are the stories that we're getting told, but we're all just people, all right? And like you were saying earlier, people just, I mean, it goes all the way back. It's people move. We're born with legs, man. You know what I mean? All these these are man-made structures. And I mean, at the root of them, they're divisive. They separate families. They separate tribes. I mean, in Africa, when these borders got set up, there were families that were just totally cut off from each other. Migratory routes, migratory routes it's totally unnatural way of for
Yeah.
it's not under a natural barrier there, and then they get set up with and they get set up with they patrolled and people are divided by means of force and aggression. So
They're
I mean, it's
divided
just
by
basically,
the differences. I gather. Yeah. And then that's
yeah.
like an
But
ancient
the
tactic,
difference,
divide and conquer,
yeah,
going back
exactly.
for many millennia at this point. But one of the other things that has divided people has been the thing that is called the Mandela Effect after Nelson Mandela. It's named
Yeah,
that after the people who remember him dying in prison. And then this new memory of him being still alive and imprisoned, and then still alive in prison, and then eventually released from prison, and then several years later, actually becoming president of South Africa, which makes me kind of wonder about the other Mandela effects. Like there are ones that I can remember. We have these books called the Berenstain Bears, of which then you look into it and it says the Berenstain Bears. And then, that doesn't make sense. Like no one's called Berenstain. That doesn't make sense as an even name. Berenstain, like that's a name. Steen, like Weinstein, like Jeffrey Weinstein. Like Berenstain. It's a common addition to a surname, and Berenstain is not a common addition to a surname, and it makes no sense. And the same thing there's a brand of underwear and other clothing line called Fruit of the Loom, and it
mm,
was featured in my memory and many other people's memory. And when we do on the internet, we could find it. There's Fruit of the Loom, a cornucopia, a horn of plenty, and a bunch of fruit. And you look it
I
up right
remember.
now, everyone like listening, looking it up, Fruit of the Loom company, and for clothing and underwear, and there is no cornucopia, there is no horn of plenty added to the logo. Makes no sense,
That is weird.
and there's a lot of examples of this, which
Yeah,
people speculate on weirdness like CERN and other electromagnetic effects to change time and such like that, to change the timeline. I mean, something like with Nelson Mandela and many public figures, I don't think because I don't remember that one, I don't have that specific memory. It doesn't I'm not part of that little group, but I know that there are people who do remember Nelson Mandela dying in prison. I guess, and like I think like you said, like what you said was like, oh, like another terrorist was, like died in prison. like that, spin. I need to clarify, why would Nelson Mandela be called a terrorist? This is what was missing for us back in America. It's a short little bit that I can read. Basically, a strong critical case argues that Nelson Mandela was directly involved in violent revolutionary activity. In 1961, Mandela co-founder Umkhonto we Sizwe. Oh wait, you can help me pronounce that.
Umkhonto we Sizwe. Yeah.
Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the African National Congress, which carried out bombings of infrastructure targets like power stations, government buildings, that at times resulted in civilian deaths and injuries. Mandela publicly endorsed armed struggle after concluding peaceful protest had failed. He was convicted in the Rivonia trial, 1964, for sabotage and conspiracy. Critics argue that regardless of later reconciliation efforts, organizing and legitimizing violence makes him morally and politically responsible for deaths caused by MK operations. A fitting standard definition of terrorist is used in this case. And then I have typed out sources and links for all of that. This is what I'm talking about. The public perception, the PR that I got in America was that this was a hero who was peaceful only, and so was his wife. This was just one little tiny snippet. There's many other aspects of kidnapping and torture and other things associated with both Mandelas, Nelson and his wife. I don't know. I don't have a Daryl intelligence agency. I don't really know. I do know that me and Ryan here have no history of advocating for violence or causing it directly. None at all. I know that we don't do that. That's for sure. I know that our existence in the places that we live has just been a benefit to people in general, that's what we do. And I do know that perception management, going way back into what you were talking about before, creates the division that really gets in the way of people seeing others as just your neighbors. I'm sure you have actual neighbors of all these different tribes that you were mentioning.
Yeah, I mean, I've stayed with. Okay, well, first off, when I was a kid, before I went to school, I was staying on a farm, and when I was on the farm, I was friends with the workers, the kids of the workers that were on the farm, on my dad's farm, right? And I used to hang out in the rondel, they call them kayas. And I used to sit and I used to go and have supper with them or whatever, But, and this is your formative years, but when you go to school, then what happened was that black kids went to a separate school and you went to a different school, and the different levels of education. So on an institutional level, okay, we were separated. It used to bother me because it was from when because I had these friends that I all of a sudden wasn't really, it was looked down upon to speak to them, and so it's different from New York in that sense, right? To what you were saying, that had been put into place many years and institutionalized many years prior to me being born. But that said, my mother and my grandmother could all speak Xhosa fluently. I mean, they would make jokes because my gran had a few trading stores. Because it was a farming community, everyone has to kind of get along, There was Land Act laws that were implemented by the British that separated people up as well, because there was a cap that was put onto what land could be bought by people of certain color. You weren't allowed to buy land if you were black, and you were only supposed to stay in certain areas. Fathers were sent off to the mines because that was the only way that they could get an income, because their land had been taken from them. I mean, it was an aggressive land grab by these people. All right, so, and there was a lot of political machinations that went along with that, and propaganda that affected people's mindset to people of other color, other races. It was institutionalized. That's why I say it's from the time of Francis Galton. This is when you've got the so-called biological evidence that was outcome based for the betterment of empire that was pushed across society, and people were propagated with this stuff, right?
Yeah, this is all about perception management and getting people to believe that based upon ancestry, then other, I would say, like ancestral differences that people have, that's enough to separate them and create the idea of better than, less than. And
Yes, exactly.
that that's been
And
pretty
then what
major. Yeah.
it was a massive project in this part of the world. But then what happens is that you've got, so you're talking about about, it's interesting because it wasn't the ANC that committed the first acts of violence. That was what is the group called now? I can't remember now. It was another group, anti-apartheid group, that was pretty much led by a bunch of it was white guys. I mean, by the way, most of them, but they had heavy links to the Fabian Socialists and the Communist Youth Leagues of America and the UK, right? So they're funding this division, but in the same, so it's a nationalism that's being pushed. So red equals black, okay, in South Africa, all right, and blue, the perception of blue, even though, like I said to you, we were living under a communist system, was linked to white, okay, to the white race. That's how they separated it up. And these acts of violence that you're talking about with Mkhonto weSizwe, all right, the Mkhonto weSizwe weren't even the catalyst for that stuff, all right. It was this other liberation party that only existed for a few years that started with the violence, right? And then what happened was, within the nationalist government of the time, the National Party, they were sending out letter bombs, and there was third force shenanigans going on within the townships. Anyone that was considered to be an activist was a target. They were taken out. There were targeted killings. Black activists mysteriously disappeared. Nelson Mandela wasn't the he was cherry picked, man, because there was a lot of people that you don't even hear about. Okay, in my town in Stadtheim, there was a day, and it was around 1985. So I don't know if in my mind, it was linked to the death of Nelson Mandela. All right, there was riots happening in front of my house. All right, on the main road. At that time, we were staying in the Anglican manse, and of course, the Anglican church was a place of safety for anyone that was caught in a riot. If you came into the church property, you were given clemency, as it were, and the police weren't allowed to touch you. All right. There were rubber bullets being fired down my main road, kids getting shot in the ribs, black kids getting shot in the ribs, and there's just a stream of people coming over the wall where I was staying, because my family was staying at the Anglican manse at that time. All right.
Wow.
So, and this was at that time. I mean, I saw things in 1985 in the state of emergency. State of emergency is what they called it, where I saw people getting. I mean, even for me, it's almost like dreamlike, because it's traumatic. As a kid of that age, I saw people getting necklaced, which it's quite a horrific thing to witness. Basically, people that were considered witches, because we used to deliver into the townships maize meal and that sort of stuff. And the one time we were driving out, and as we were driving out, I saw in the back they basically grabbed this woman who they considered to be a witch, which was or she had been earmarked as an informant to the national government. They put a tire over her and they set it alight. So there was a lot of crazy things going on at that time. And it wasn't even reported on. You didn't hear about it in the news. You've got
Yeah,
this
we
massive riot.
didn't I didn't get to know about all of this until the internet happened. And
Yeah,
everything you're mentioning, none of it is a shocker. A bunch of it, like, I have heard, some of it was new, but all of this has been learned from me thanks to internet ability, like actual boots on the ground like you, like now freely able to say what's real instead of the standard, like simple, like mainstream media networks. Just to jump
Yeah.
back to the full title of the book by Darwin, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. And
Yeah.
here's the thing that was promoted by Galton, promoted by the intelligentsia of the time, just to promote the division that there are the chosen races and then there are the inferior races. I think
Yeah.
that that's the part, that type of perception management, even up to the present day, where we have a lot of folks right now talking about Minnesota, state of Minnesota, and a whole bunch of fake Somali daycare centers, which is mostly it's a news thing over here. It's a fabrication of scams and fraud that was perpetrated that like really trickles back a whole bunch of money to wealthy people, wealthy politicians over there in Minnesota. But on the other hand, very unwealthy Somali refugees and folks who snuck in or legally immigrated see like a money trough to go to. And then there's the reality of years of harsh, hardcore Somali life leading up to an average IQ of 68, allegedly. Meaning that's, by the way, 70 is retarded IQ wise. And then, so we're talking average being 68. We have a whole lot of inbred retarded people, potentially. And that's supposed to be nasty thing to say. Reality, it's just we're talking about reality thing to say. That's a reality thing for this. That's really sad to have a bunch of people potentially scoring pretty low on the IQ. That's not good, And so boots on the ground try to verify these things. You were there kind of amidst the violence of that sounds like the 80s.
Yeah. That's
What
85.
happened
That's around.
over the decades? Has there been any change to the patterns of in general the pattern of racism and violence in general? Like, and is it any shifting in any way?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, once apartheid had been implemented, you can take down the politics, but the ongoing effect, the effects from what has been pushed in the first place, that tends to live on because it's very difficult to kill an idea, all right, if not impossible, all right. But people generally just want to get along. You know what I mean? They don't really care about that stuff, and it does start to fall apart because it doesn't have a basis in actual truth. In actual fact, unless people adopt it as part of their culture, all right, to be racist. Okay, so of course, within the South African context, the language Afrikaans that got lumped in as a racist language. All right, even though it was born in the kitchens of Cape Town amongst a variety of people. It's a mix of Dutch, Flemish, You've got Arabic name words in there. You've got Khoisan words in there. It's a mix. It's mainly Dutch and German as well, and English. I mean, and it's basically a mix of all those things, and it became its own language. But then it got politicized, and what happens is that as soon as you politicize that language, then you've got another wedge that you can drive between people. People didn't want to get taught in Afrikaans because it was associated the being with a racist regime, okay, and the politics that came, even though the language had existed long before that, okay, because the National Party had adopted that language as the Volkstaal, is what they call it, okay, and they had put a whole fairy tale behind how that language had been derived. Now all of a sudden became politicized, even though the majority of people in South Africa that speak Afrikaans are actually what is known as colored. Okay, it's different. It's a different way of saying it in the States, but colored people are basically a mixed race of people that came from slaves. Okay,
Mm.
Creoles that were brought to South Africa, Bushmen. It's a mix. The largest language group in South Africa is Zulu. After that is Afrikaans. That's the second largest language, and it's not just white people that speak it. but it got politicized and it got made into a political tool. And then what happens is people get proud. They act as if white people act as, you had this upper sort of this Ponzi type of Afrikaans that was only spoken by the white people in Pretoria, right? And that was supposed to be a sign of nationalist. I'm a better patriot than you, because my accent is better than yours. I mean, the same happens in the States, for instance. If someone comes from the deep South, and you've got that Southern drawl, it makes them more Southern. Same in South Africa. If I come from Cape Town, then I've got a certain way accent that I speak. It makes me Kaapenaar, because I'm from the Cape,
Wow.
Cape Flats or whatever. So it's a part of your identity. So then what happens is that then all of a sudden you've got this racial aspect that gets amended, a pin to that as well. And you've got people in the Northwest that they think it's part of their national heritage to be full-on Afrikaans racist, and that'll be, you'll find those people in the Northwest or whatever, and they bought into that cultural thing. But it's not a natural way of being. It's something that gets added to your personality. It's part of our programming, and humans are highly programmable. So that's and that's the game that's being played. And it's the same with the British. The British in the Cape Province in Natal, there's a sort of a snobbishness that goes with being the British colonizer. You breathe a different sort of air because of if you come from that background, and it's linked to academia as well and all sorts of things. Rhodes Institute, the different universities that are over here. So you've got that sort of stratification. It's all part of divide and rule and divide and conquer. I mean, you mentioned that earlier, and that goes all the way back. I mean, it's well trodden.
It's a long history of divide and conquer. The difference is now people have access to information like this. People can actually take a moment to think and to say, I don't think Afrikaans is probably a racist language any more than Cajun Creole is a racist language, which is actually a mix of French, English, and who knows which kind of Native American words thrown in there, but no one would go to Louisiana, to New Orleans, for example, and no one would go there and say, look at all these people speaking this racist language. No one would go into the bayou there and say, oh, that's racist,
But it's interesting you say that, because those were the southern states, right? Those were the slave owners. Were they not? That would have been considered.
Well, no, there's the thing, right? You look it up, and there's like a very small percentage of actual people who own slaves. We're talking less than 5% in general. And then of those 5%, there's even a substantial number of people of alleged African descent owning and mistreating their slaves on a huge percentage compared to, the folks of European descent who did, percentage-wise less mistreatment, because that was, it's profitable to make it to not hurt people compared to hurting them. This is kind of like a pattern that keeps getting seen over history of the pattern of people who can be more easily manipulated into violence against those who look like them is really common. This is super common. It's common everywhere, like in England, where, oh, you're from North Southamptonshire. Well, I hate you because I'm from South Southamptonshire. I mean, they're right there. They are the same, look the same ancestry, same people almost. And the same for rivalry between Cambodia and Vietnam, right next to each other. Honestly, looking, sounding pretty damn similar. This is a pattern, and the pattern, of course, in inner cities. The chances of violence happening against you if you're black are probably from someone who is black. That's the way it has been. This is manufactured, just like you were saying. You grew up with other children coming from these different ancestries. They're your friends. And then, of course, where you were, because back then, that there was this hardcore kind of separation, division thing. Where I was, it was the beginning of softening, the beginning of making things more integrated, like what they called the melting pot, but it really was like the neighborliness of New York City just kept getting more and more peaceful over time. We have things called the, FBI crime stats, the Federal Bureau of Investigation crime
Yeah.
statistics. We have actual global statistics. Violence keeps going down in the US every single year. Did that ever track over there? Did you ever look at the stats of actual violence, like the whole necklacing thing of immolating and burning people? Has this in any way decreased?
Um, yeah, that's an interesting question because I don't know if you remember recently, there were a whole bunch of white refugees that Trump took in. I don't know if you remember that whole
Yep.
debacle that was going on. Okay, so the thing is that crime in South Africa, it's a very interesting because there's third forces that are going on here as well, and crime is encouraged in certain ways. All right, and it's not just against white people; it's across all races. This is the thing, but it's easy to cherry pick as well when you can, like that whole thing with Trump was a very divisive within South Africa. People were hating on each other because you had this one group who thought they were getting picked on. But the truth of the matter is that there's engineering they're engineering violence against average people within South Africa based on these tools that they have. Assimilating culture and then putting in, and like what you do with a petri dish of culture, you add a little bit of lemon in there, right? And you can manipulate it. You can have someone that goes in and it's like a soothsayer. They whisper things in people's ears, and like, I don't know if you've ever been to a protest where you'll be walking down and it's supposed to, I mean, I don't do that stuff anymore, but you'll be walking down and it'll be a peaceful protest with people with banners, and then all of a sudden you've got some guy that comes in and says, yeah, throw a brick, do that now, you know what I mean? Or someone that instigates the violence, all right? Well, the same thing happens in South Africa. I'm not saying that because people are also, they get pushed down economically where they feel that they have no choice. I'm not saying that's an excuse. That victim mentality, I got no time for it, right? But there are a lot of people that think they've got an excuse to go because they've bought into the idea that they've got this head cage on that the white guy is the bad guy, so that they can go, it gives them an excuse to go and rob from that guy, okay? But unfortunately, it doesn't just work that way, because across that line, or whatever your path is, there's a lot of soft targets within the townships that are easy to break in and commit violence. And of course, there's issues with alcoholism and drug abuse and all that kind of stuff that has got a rich history all the way back, because that breaks, in the general sense, that breaks down communities as well. It's a form of chemical warfare, if you will,
Yeah.
that gets pushed into the communities, and then you've got violence. Then you've got a shattering of community across all levels, whether it be women, boys versus girls, gay versus straight, white versus black, all these aspects. I mean, and in South Africa, there's so many points because you've got so many different languages and cultures where you can create these perceptions of the other, that guy's the bad guy. It's just ostracization. That's all it is. It goes all the way back to the Greeks.
Hey, there's anecdotal experience, like what you and I experienced in our life. And then
Yeah.
there's actually trying to verify real statistics, which I know is very shaky ground, because we cannot verify the gathering of the statistics because we don't have our own private intelligence agencies to verify real actual data points. So we're sort of like melding the two together. From my own personal experience, I see less and less overt versions of racism as someone who's actually like holding on to discrimination. In all of my time in North America, like I spent, like, basically, I know I've only lived in a few places, but I have traveled globally a bit, and
Yeah.
those places: New York, Vermont, Hawaii.
Yeah.
and
But
across all of the states several times, just like, little times, little here and there, America's pretty big,
mhm.
it's pretty damn big, but yeah, like to spend a lot of time in everywhere is impossible, but to spend a little time in a few places is doable. And then
Yeah.
in time, just less and less of that, the more and more of an open-minded, certainly in my own personal life, as soon as I got out of elementary school, no more violence, and forced association is the number one way to experience violence. I was forced to be there, and they were forced to be there. We didn't want to be around each other. That's basically the recipe for a prison, and that's violence.
Yeah.
Like all across my whole life has been less actual prejudice, less bigotry, and less violence. And I see that reflected in the stats as well. And I see, like, of course, global prosperity going up. There are awesome things that like have made the standards of living for everyone has just gone up all across the board. Has any of that been any reflected in your experience in South Africa?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, that's exactly it. There's covert racism and there's overt racism, right? Okay. And it's the same thing with covert slavery and overt slavery. All right. So you had the end of slavery, say for instance, in the States, it would have been the end of the Civil War. That's the story you've told or whatever. And then you move over to something that is a little bit more hidden. All right. So, and I agree with you. The racism, it's really frowned upon to base any of your decisions on the color of someone's skin. What I'm talking about is something that happens almost. I mean, I don't want to subconsciously. You have to see where you're at. So, for instance, if I'm walking down the street in downtown Joburg or Cape Town, I know that I'm going to be a target. I have to be aware because of the color of my skin, because people are going to make certain assumptions based on that privilege. Okay, like a privilege that has been assigned to me. But it's not politicized in that sense. It's something that is kind of, it's part of it's not a subconscious, but it's underlying. But if I'm talking to a black guy or black guy's talking to me, there's no boss and subject, king and subject or whatever you want to call it. There's none of that sort of thing. In South Africa, I wouldn't say that racism is like it used to be. It's like you say, people are way more open to talking to one another, and it's a lot better. But if I go to the mines, if the majority of the guys that are going down into the ground who are getting paid minimum wage, they're going to be black in South Africa. Okay. If I go to a petrol station, it's the die is cast in a sense because of what's happened in the past. It's a lot more difficult because there's a lot more black people in this country for someone to have been brought up under Bantu education to move and they're on the back foot from where they start, and that is what it is. It's like you were saying about land. This is the situation we've got. We can't you can't wallow in your victimhood either. I don't come from a privileged background either. You know what I mean? I'm just an average white guy in South Africa. I was born here, man. I can't change the color of my skin. I can't be proud of it. I can't be ashamed of it. It is what it is. This is
It
the
is
whole
that.
thing.
Yeah, and
Uh,
this is your lived experience. I agree with you. Like, yeah, there's actual impact of what happened back then, the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The previous to that, the whole century of hardcore, the Dutch East India Company, British East India Company, like hardcore warfare, and a divide and conquer, like taking over land kind of thing. All of that stuff leaves a mark. But now here we are in
exactly.
the modern world, and we see like a constant increase in people's standard of living everywhere across the world. And I'm pretty sure South Africa is the wealthiest and most highest standard of living on the continent of Africa, as far as I know. Although, Libya had some power for a period of time before they bombed the crap out of it. And I will say they, because I'm not part of the them who did the bombing
No,
at all,
totally.
but you know what I mean? Like with money and stuff like that, there's the gold, the natural resources, the trickle down ability, and the wise investment of people who were not fully traumatized, both of European descent and African descent, raises the standard of living. Modern tools like I try to promote, like the Bitcoin, have added to that. I don't know what South African policies or your Bitcoin exchanges available are over there. Do you have laws on the books that like make challenges to Bitcoin or crypto, or what? How does that go?
I no, I don't think it's not. It's pretty. You can purchase things online using Bitcoin. You can't really go into the shops and use it currently. Um, the
But I meant laws, like no one, you don't go into the shop. You can't go into a shop with a gold bar or a gold coin or a silver coin. Like you can't do that now. That's Bitcoin is like that. It's an asset. You can't go and have a deed to real estate and go into a shop and buy stuff with it. Bitcoin is like that. It's an asset. It's not a currency. Please don't think of it as a currency. It's an asset. Okay. What I was referring to is laws. Like there are countries that have restrictive laws that make it hard to go on an exchange, to go back and forth, rand to Bitcoin, Bitcoin to rand, etc., or not.
No. It's pretty easy to exchange between the two over here. It's not really an issue. You just got to there's websites that you just do the exchange. It's pretty straightforward.
That's called freedom.
Yeah, no, for sure. Look, I mean, the thing is, right? This all boils down to materialism and material dialectics, and then you start getting into Marx. It goes all the way back to Greek philosophy, all the way back to Democritus with his ideas on materialism. Throughout Western history, we've got this wars, coup d'état upon coup d'état. Okay, I mean, I get what you're saying about the general sort of standard of living, and yes, the standard of living in South Africa, even though people have been herded into the cities, it does create this idea of scarcity when everyone's herded into sort of the urban areas. The standard of living in terms of the material wealth has kind of gone up, but there's been a massive decline of the middle class in a sense. I mean, where I stay now, I'm staying in a very opulent area, but it's all foreigners that have moved in here. It's all guys that's being used as a tax haven, right? And the middle class South Africans they're losing ground a little bit over here. So, but in general, I think the standard of living in the world has gone up. But I don't know, man. Like we've still got crime. We've still got crime in South Africa. There's pretty much no one that is untouched. I've been mugged before. When I first moved down to Hart Bay, I went for a jog and I got held up by two guys with knives. I'm sure that there's crime everywhere, Whereas when I was a kid, we used to go for hikes for days. We used to hang out. People didn't care about what time we came back home. You know what I mean? It wasn't, the parents weren't so. Now you've got 15-minute cities around Cape Town. Everyone's got they stay within complexes. Like it looks like high security walls and electric fences. So I mean, they might have stuff, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's freedom.
Okay.
You get what I'm saying? Like they've got all the material.
I do, yeah.
Yeah. So there's kind of there's kind of an inversion. I mean, I'd equate it to this, right? So someone that stays in Congo, you walk out, you go to Central Africa. There's fruit, there's food, there's as much food as you want. There's land for days and extra days, but don't have a cent to your name, right? Whereas if you go into the cities, then all of a sudden you can't. If you go into the concrete jungles, you can't do anything without. You're going to starve on the streets, So which person is, what is wealth? In Africa, we've got fertile land over here. In Joburg, I was able to grow. I mean, we can eat. I can harvest water. We can do whatever you want. But you might have not have money in your bank account. So that's another. It's all about perception as well, I guess. So
That
that's
makes sense.
that's that. Our economic systems of capitalism versus communism. It's all based on that material wealth, and that's where people think that they derive their freedom. I mean, Marx was all about that, the seizing of the means of production. Going to the factories and grabbing the factories. Meantime, the means of production is actually the soil under your feet, and that's up to each individual to take control over to some degree. That's how it's been in Africa for a long time.
It's a different reality. I know that there are real crime areas in a similar way around every single city that that's going to happen. I mean, the United States of America has a lot of cities that have a lot of areas that are dangerous and violent. And between those big cities are all these mostly peaceful areas
Yeah,
where you're going to get mugged. And I'm grateful, like I chose to live here on this island because for the most part, thanks to the time period and the people who are here, there's a lot, like it's like the violence has like lowered and lowered and lowered decade by decade here where I am. There are problem areas over near the city of Honolulu on the island of Oahu, 2 islands over. There's 1 million people on that whole island, and amongst all of those people, they're mostly concentrated right there in Honolulu. And there
exactly.
are, hardcore slum areas where it would be dangerous to walk around Waianae, so I've heard. I haven't been there. Like I haven't spent like tons of time over there yet. I'm thinking of more vacations over there because we just had a little vacation over there and it was awesome.
Yeah.
I'm aiming to do it again. I bet you I could have a vacation in South Africa that has a good time with a good tour, and like have to see amazing stuff, to see the things that I want to see, which is your old architecture built at anomalous time periods with weird stuff, like we mentioned in the chat. I am curious about what are the laws of the gun freedom, like the ability to keep and bear arms there. Like what's the regulations like for you out there in South Africa?
I think it's kind of, well, they might be a little bit looser in the States, but you've got to have a license to have firearms over here. They keep on trying to tighten those laws. People keep resisting. In South Africa, we've got a term we call it, we're harde gat. So it means that we're stubborn in a sense. Okay. People don't want to give their guns over. There was a whole drive a few years back to try and get people to hand in their guns, and relicensing and all sorts of rubbish. But people aren't having it. There's people like their freedom over here, and I mean, yeah. In terms of what you were saying earlier about those areas, it's interesting for me because it's the same over here. You find those issues within where the population is condensed. That's why cities like the whole metaphor of cities being Babylon. Within reggae music and whatever. I mean, that goes all the way back to Tigris and Euphrates, right? And the idea of being able to control the resources and the flow of the river, the energy, okay? And putting people into concentrated areas because it's easier to subjugate them like that and to keep them in a lower frequency, okay? When people are on top of each other like that, because they feel like there's limits to their growth, all right? There's limits to their resources. Nature, when you're out in nature, you realize that nature gives abundantly, and that's the difference. It's a mindset of scarcity, and that's why people are fighting. It's like a bucket of crabs trying to get out.
Oh yeah, the bucket of crabs, by the way, metaphor of crabs up in a bucket, and one of them is just about like to escape, and then another crab will grab the crab and pull them down. This is, of course, it's not like it has to happen. It happens a lot, and in a
Yeah,
similar way, folks who are succeeding sometimes there's a resentment for folks who are succeeding, and then someone is going to try to stop them from succeeding. That has been a pattern. The
Well,
difference is
that's what the whole Marxist philosophy is based on, is stealing from stealing. It's based on stealing from
it's
people.
based on greed, yeah,
Yeah.
and I don't think I think that's going to be a different perception management show that we could do on that whole topic. But I would just jump right back to there was this other crime that happened, and I call it World War COVID. It was a world war asymmetrical, because wars basically are a, a bunch of destruction and death and capturing various markets. That's what happened. That's what wars are about, capturing markets and causing death. The interesting thing, though, that all-cause mortality didn't start increasing until after the COVID vaccination. I saw what happened in the blue states, like where I live in Hawaii. State of Hawaii, blue state, means gangster state, by the way, means alleged Democrat Party controlled. It means stupid people. By the way, a whole bunch of Asian people of Asian descent, also means stupid. I'm sorry, just means that way. It means order followers and old means stupid. Old in general means stupid. It means they get their information from the news. Young
Yeah.
means smarter, generally speaking, means computer savvy, means parsing various different narratives. Old means stupid, and this is a retired old area. Therefore, these are old order followers, people who masked up, like a large portion of people, they all got the COVID vaccination and stuff. This is what order followers, people with less education, people with less thinking do. What was it like over there? Like, how hardcore were the rules of the lockdown and things like that?
I think it was ubiquitous. I think you guys had the same issues with on your side. On my side, I had a very personal run-in with that whole situation. I used to be in a boxing club in Joburg in Sophiatown, and a very close friend of mine was Zambian, and another guy was from Lesotho. Both black guys, and they were quite aware of the experiments that had been conducted across Africa with the AIDS pandemic, and with and they and the stories that we're getting from people with boots on the ground about what was going on with these Gates funded vaccination centers. And we used to speak a lot, and because of the cross-pollination of cultures, I basically found out about this stuff. If I had been staying in my bubble of just hanging out with the community, I probably would have been vaccinated. But I was fortunate enough to be able to hang out with people that were savvy to this stuff. That's why Africa has got such a low rate of vaccination, because people are sick and tired of being guinea pigs. I was at the time I was in a punk band. And I posted on my social media basically saying, guys, this is a big test, and it's an experiment from before the lockdowns happened. And basically I was ousted from the punk scene straight away. Okay. I'm not saying I was the only white person there was. I mean, I knew about this stuff as well from my own explorations as well, but we used to talk a lot amongst my community, and I wasn't part of the standard. I'm not trying to sound better than what I am, but that's what life threw me at the time. I was surrounded by people of different cultures and different backgrounds, fortunately, and we got to speak. Whereas for the most part, people kind of stayed in their camps ever since. They carried on in the same sort of vein. People weren't hanging out to cross the color line as much, but people did. Don't get me wrong, I'm not alone in that, but a lot of people kind of just accepted the narrative and went along with it. And there's a generalized statement that I'm making there as well, because everyone has their own experience and their own version of not their own version of common sense. There's certain things that people don't want to buy into, but you know, there's so many twists and turns that were fed in terms of the narrative that people kind of got corralled in a certain way, and there are a lot of journeys that were sort of catered for within that campaign of COVID. I mean, the left and the right were cordoned off in a sense. You know, that you had the DA, which is kind of supposed to be the more white liberal side of things. They were in lockstep with their vaccinations. You have the African National Congress that were also in lockstep with it as well. Then you had no one in Parliament within the political spheres ever questioned it, to put it that way. You know what I mean? So if you were part of a certain political persuasion, you were getting told to take that jab. Didn't matter. There wasn't a left versus right thing with that at all. You know what I mean?
You said the punk scene. You got ousted from the punk scene when you were in a punk band back then. Can you sort of elaborate on that, like when you started speaking your mind?
Well, okay. So the band that I was in, we were very socially aware because punk isn't really a part of African culture. Okay, the whole punk rock scene in South Africa. One might think so, but it's not. Okay, it's very much white middle class for the most part. Okay, we'd have black kids at the shows in suburbia, but it wasn't something that was the norm. All right, back in the early 2000s, even late 90s, it wasn't really something that would happen. Okay, you would consider it to be white liberal and maybe anti-conscription. You didn't want to go to the army because you didn't want to go shoot your fellow countrymen. They would call you names and all sorts of things, and that would be in the later 90s and the 2000s. That would have been where the punks would have been in terms of your demographic. Okay, sort of people that were anti-conscription and that kind of. I guess that's the best way for me to describe it at this stage. But then what happened was that was still
2020.
basically 2020. By that time, my band we had made inroads into the townships. We were trying to play shows at the townships. We'd go play at protests when there was in front of Parliament. We set up some pop-up shows and things like that. We actually played. So we're quite active on the ground there, and we made a point of going to play in the townships, like to go play in Soweto or Mamelodi or wherever. Okay, we would set up shows like that, and that was kind of the goal of the band, to try and get different communities talking to each other. Okay, and there was a start. At that time there started to be a growth of the punk rock music scene in Soweto, and there were bands that were starting to pop up. Okay, and of course there was other media that was coming in, that was in conjunction, that was pushing that, and a lot of that stuff was even Soros funded, I'm pretty sure. Okay, but there was a certain narrative that went with that. So I'll give you an example of, because I'm very familiar with the history that was going on within the UK and stuff. You had the whole two-tone movement. You had bands like The Clash. You had Bruce Springsteen. You had all these sort of people that were pushing a certain sort of narrative, right? But if you think about it, so for instance, in the 80s, there was a show in England called Rock Against Racism, right? And it was bands like The Specials, The Clash, The Damned, all these bands that were playing over there. But when you have that kind of show, you're not going to have someone from the National Front coming to that show, because they're going to get the crap beaten out of them. You're not going to have a conversation happening at a Rock Against Racism show. It's all you're kind of singing to the choir, right? And in that sense, it becomes a divisive tool, all right? Because you're not going to have people from a different perspective talking to each other, not an eclectic sort of conversation, right? And the reason that was done was because at that time in the 80s, under Thatcher, you had a lot of Jamaican immigrants coming through to the UK. You had a lot of people from Pakistan or wherever coming, and they were working shoulder to shoulder with white workers, working class people, right? And they were talking, and that's why you started having an influx of reggae music in the arts and things like that. And of course, the powers that be don't want people talking to each other. So you start to have this injection of into the culture of, now all of a sudden, skinheads. Bob Marley was a skinhead. He was a rude boy, all right, in Jamaica. The original Rude Boys that went into the UK were they liked reggae music, they liked rocksteady music, right? And that got introduced into the amongst the factory workers, all right. Now all of a sudden you've got the National Front, and they infiltrated the skinhead movement, and they made it about whiteness, okay, and that creates a division. And then you've got skinhead shows that are happening with bands like Screwdriver. So now you've got the wedge that is driven into the UK, in the UK, and you've got racial violence that starts to crop up there. Meantime, on the fact, a guy that's sweating next to another guy in the factory, they don't give a toss about what color the skin is, as long as you're getting together, and afterwards you're going to have a party. In real life, that's what happens. People listen to music, they sit around a fire and they tell stories. Doesn't matter about what color you are, but it becomes something that you can make into a political device, because it helps people to control. It helps to control people in a general sense. Okay, because of using the media and the news or whatever. I mean, we understand this. You and I understand this. I'm sure most of your listeners understand this. But in South Africa, it was ramped up to ratchet it up, and it still exists. But people have to be politically correct a lot of the times. So a lot of times they're polite to each other's faces, and they'll talk shit about each other behind their backs when they go back to home to their families. You know what I mean? So it's like it's very, it's very surface level. It's like you're looking at in Afrikaans they call it oppervlakkig. It's conceited. It's what it's a conceited way of looking at things. It's not really a deep-rooted communal sort of sense of looking at things where people think they need to say the right things. You can't be straight up and talk about it. And what happens is that those problems just fester underneath the surface instead of people being straight up with each other. But once people start to talk openly and honestly and be honest with each other, then those problems get sorted out. It doesn't have to fester to the point where people have to pick up a gun and start fighting with each other. You know what I mean? And that's why there's such a constant push to, like with Trump now as well, there's all this this racial sort of narrative that's going on that politicizes people's views and generalizes people and puts them into certain categories, which isn't necessarily the truth. And people, when they look at it from the outside of social media or whatever, they think that everyone's a certain way that agrees with certain things that Trump says, or certain things that Biden says, or certain things that whatever political, because they have to put some sort of truth in there, otherwise no one's going to believe it, But
this is all part of perception management that I love to harken back to periodically. I mean, one of the things that I was pleased with is that you were familiar with Richard Grove, his show nowadays, Grand Theft World, then maybe some of his other work, maybe ancillary other producers like James Corbett, The Corbett Report. I'm not sure, but how did you come upon these people and when? And let's just start with you found some other pieces of information. You found me, for example, but I'm just I'm ancillary to them. Like I've been on Rich's show in the way past, like we're talking, 10 plus years ago. But I definitely, the consuming of this type of very self-aware, questioning narrative people, how did you find that? Because this is a big internet, and when was that?
Look, I mean, I've always kind of thought that there was something not right. I could go back to my upbringing. My mother converted from being hardcore Lutheran to Seventh-day Adventist because she had found out the whole story about Constantine, and so that kind of got me on my path. Got me onto my path of questioning what I was being told by institutionalized religious or the politicians or school or whatever it is. But when it comes to my internet journey, I guess it started with the movie Zeitgeist, which was introduced to me by my friend Andrew from Zambia. He showed me that. but before that, even I was on a peer-to-peer service called Hotline, because it was difficult to get hold of music in South Africa. Music that was kind of a little bit more politically motivated or socially had social narrative to it. So I was always online looking for those kinds of things. I'm trying to think of when I got in touch. I guess Dollar Vigilante was one that I came across
Ooh.
just shortly after lockdowns happened, and that put me onto sort of I was I can't remember his name now, but yeah,
That's Jeff
I
Berwick
followed
of
him.
the Dollar Vigilante. He
Jeff
also
Berwick,
had a
that's right.
show called Anarchast, where he got to feature a lot of the many of the media producers that I have great respect for still. Like these, like
Yeah,
Richard Grove
yeah,
and James Corbett, for example.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess Dollar Vigilante was where I got onto it, and then I was put onto that by another friend of mine from Joburg. She was an older lady and a friend of colleague of mine that I used to work with, an old rocker, and she told me about Jeff Berwick and Dollar Vigilante, and from there I kind of got onto a whole bunch of, I guess, Grand Theft World, James Corbett, what on earth is happening with the uh,
Mark Passio.
Mark Passio, yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Mark Passio is legendary. But James Corbett, I've got utmost respect for, because especially Richard Grove and James Corbett, because of their links that they've got. And it gives me the opportunity to go and look at, to double check and cross reference their stuff. It's not just an emotive sort of attack on some political party. It's actually, because I'm skeptical of all that stuff because of the history of South Africa, and I'm not the only one. Don't get me wrong. People are skeptical in South Africa because of the past, because they realize they got lied to about Nelson Mandela. I'm not like, just in case of point. I mean, I'm skeptical about the Mandela effect in terms of what we're told as well, because I tell you, like, from that, I mean, it could totally be some strange thing, but if you think about it, it's the forefront of the media, right? In that particular instance, I can't say for sure about Fruits of the Loom or anything like that, but I am familiar with what you're talking about, because I'm familiar with that brand. But the Mandela effect, particularly as it pertains to Nelson Mandela, right? My friends were getting sent out to the border, and they were sent out to Soweto, and they were coming back with PTSD, right? There was a conscription campaign going on. The idea of the black, what the blacks were going to do to you if they took over, it was a heavy fear campaign going on there. The Red Terror was a big thing. Cuba, Russia, all these kinds of things were going on, and their alignment to the ANC as an organization, that was what was getting pushed. Nelson Mandela was he was this faceless terrorist, okay? They never showed his face on TV, all right? And then I do remember vaguely, okay, reports on the news of him dying, okay? And around that time, what was happening was there was a lot of violence that was happening on the streets across the board, right? But what struck me as odd was that Winnie Mandela was treated like royalty in South Africa. She was under house arrest or surveillance, or whatever you want to call it. But when at certain times she would be put out into the public space, she was more of a face than Nelson Mandela, all right? There was a whole story that happened with her and people that she had killed that came out in the news. There were obviously all the bombings that were happening under the ANC and in the name of Nelson Mandela and Mkhonto where those things were publicized. But the things that weren't publicized were the letter bombs that were going out, and something that also struck me as odd is a lot of these bombings that were happening at the time. It was black people that were being killed, all right, and it was close to the Indian embassy. So you didn't know if it was the South African government that was making them into patsies. The lines started getting blurred. It was just terror that was going on, right? There were bombings that was going on. There were necklacings that were going on. So people were living under the cosh, right? And it wasn't just white people. It wasn't just black people. People were in a state of trauma across the board. So the war was on the civilians of the country, all right? Whether it didn't matter if it was white, black, or indifferent, okay? But you felt like you were under attack because that was the story that was getting told, all right? And it was us versus them. And of course, the media that was happening on the ground, because the publications that were under the same umbrella publishers, right? The story that we were getting, I'm not saying that it was all under the same publishers, but if you go back to, if you follow the money, that there was a common root. But the stories that were getting told in Soweto were different from the stories that were getting told in Joburg, Joburg CBD and the suburbs, right? It was all curated. The stories were curated accordingly, okay, to what color you were, because the color bar had been put out there, all right. So what happens is that there is this mythical character of Nelson Mandela, all right, that is put into the public conscious, right? And it's almost like that myth gets put into the spotlight. And what happens is that you can have multiple stories that are going along these channels. And there might be something that comes out about him dying, but it can be quickly dispelled because everything is muddied. All the waters are muddied. All right. Now all of a sudden you can have a whole lot of violence that happens in 1985, people taking to the streets because the word is leaked out that he's died in prison. All right. And there may well have been an imposter. All right. That was put in his place. I don't know. I can't say for sure. But that
Right.
story gets out. That story gets out. This, you've got violence that happens. Then you find out that there's a story. Then all of a sudden, Winnie Mandela comes out and she says, she basically ignores the rumor and just says, "Oh, there's a whole bunch of other stuff. Go back to bed. It's okay. You're still alive." She's the mouthpiece for the overarching narrative that is being pushed. Both both the ANC and the Nats, okay, the National Party, they were tools for the British Empire, and they were both espousing this opposing narrative because they want to keep people at each other's throats. Okay, so that's the story, all right? Like, I'll give you an interesting example, right? So during the Boer War, just as an example, okay, and this goes back even further, but the Boer War, right? There's a company called Vickers, okay, that is supplying arms to both the British and to the Boers, all right? This is Sir Basil Zarhoff, okay, Sir Basil Zarhoff. He's considered to be like a British national treasure, okay? He's a dodgy so and so, okay? He's supplying arms to Arabs, to Israelis. Like, this is the time of the First World War as well. The same thing happened over the First World War. Sir Basil Zarov, go check that guy out. He's supplying arms to the British and to the Boers at the time, okay? When you've got this division between Anglicization and the Afrikaner folk, okay? Both different versions of nationalism, all right? And one is for the Queen and one is against the Queen, all right? Then you've got the Zulus, the Zulu Wars, and all these other things. So you've got a fractured society that has been engineered even back then. But the arms companies are still coming up trumps because they're selling arms to everyone, okay? And that's South Africa, okay? And that's the game that's getting played. The National Party, 1961, Nelson Mandela comes out. He's not even the head of the ANC. He's only just been made head of Mkhonto we Sizwe, the armed division. They go straight for him. They never interviewed Oliver Tambo. He doesn't get interviewed. None of those guys get interviewed. It's only Nelson Mandela. 1 year later, Nelson Mandela gets arrested, and then he gets sent into prison. Okay, he becomes the martyr. All right, and from that point on, the overseas media is telling one story about him being peaceful. Okay, but from that point on, both entities are ramping up violence against the average citizen of South Africa, white, black, Indian, Chinese, everyone. Okay, and they're using these two opposing forces, okay, of the ANC and the National Party, who are both nationalist, okay, fighting against each other to put everyone in the crosshairs. All right, so that's the game that was getting played, and throughout that time, South Africa is trading arms. They're trading chemical weapons. They're dealing with nuclear weapons via Israel. Doesn't matter about the the sanctions that are getting placed, they were using Israel as a middleman to trade with Russia and with America and with Argentina. Like there's a whole thing with the Falklands War. Do you remember the Falklands War with under Thatcher, right? Okay. So there was this missile that was developed, all right, in France. Okay, it was called the Exocet missile. Okay, it was a missile that was launched from a plane, but it skimmed just across above the water. That technology to make it skim just across the water was developed in South Africa. Okay, under under it was developed in Stellenbosch by arms company. All right, I can't remember what it's. I can't remember what the arms company is. It'll come to me just now. Anyways, that patent was sold to Argentina. Now, it's a French company that is with, I mean, politically, if we believe all the machinations that we're told, all right, okay, France and England are together on this, okay, they're part of, and South Africa is still part of the Commonwealth, okay, we're still part of England, okay, in a sense, right, because that's the Commonwealth, right, we're supposed to be kind of still friends with the UK because they won the Boer War, right? We're
I'm
selling
going to inject
arms.
here for people who don't know what a commonwealth is. You can look up commonwealth countries, and there are even a few commonwealth states. The state of Massachusetts is also known as the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. But there's a legal and economic and potential viable legal history that stretches back from the earliest eras of where the Windsors took over and where essentially this German family took over the British royal family, and from there holdings of land around the world are still centralized in power right over there. I mean, there's many books on this topic. There's even a movie, Ring of Power, going over the three city-states of where London, for example, is the central seat of all economic power. The Vatican City is the central seat of all, I would say, perception management, ecclesiastical power. And then, of course, Washington, D.C. is the central place of all military power. Now, this is just like three rings to control the world. By the way, those three places are outside of the countries that are around them, meaning literally D.C. is not part of America on legal paperwork. It's not. It's not part of it. Literally, the city of London is not part of England. And literally, Vatican City, especially, this is well known, is not part of Italy, or its greater Rome or surrounding it. These are separate, unlegal pieces of paper. All of that being legal fiction, by the way, which matters to those who have the guns and the money to back stuff up, which is what they do. So the Commonwealth, as you're saying, yes, South Africa is a Commonwealth. There's some incredible history of manipulation. I call these places tax farms. You live in,
Yeah,
like surrounded by that specific tax farm that you're on. I'm over here on this tax farm. That's the way it goes because it's a worldwide power situation. This is this would be stressful to someone who's just waking up to this, but both you and I, Ryan, we've woken up to this stuff a long time ago. We came upon the works of Richard Grove and James Corbett a long time ago, relatively speaking. For me, it's been 20 plus years.
yeah.
What I focus on at the ends of the show, because we're coming up to the ends of the show, is I like to sort of shift a little bit to say, perception management wise is one thing. What do we do to make life better ourselves, for our loved ones? Even what you've said today, in what ways is it used in a positive way?
Well, to take responsibility for oneself, and I guess the whole thing is to once you start to realize the game that's being played. Mark Basio is correct when he says it's about shadow work. Like the whole game is played by having an enemy, by forgetting about the unified field that we are all actually connected. All right, and realizing that the only way things are going to change is if we behave out of respect to one another and to ourselves, actually, because Yeah, I mean that's how we can, and then we don't need to have politicians or anyone directing our actions, because there's no one else to blame except for yourself. You've got to take responsibility for yourself. It starts from the individual. I'm not the most eloquent, but that's that. If everyone just did that, we'd be fine. You know, it's that simple. And I can't speak for other people. I mean, I don't want to be hurt, so I'm not going to hurt someone else. It's that simple. You know, just having self-respect and letting that, behaving in the same way that you want to be treated. You know.
That is
So yeah.
perfect. That's a beautiful way to end it. And like this is just the crafting of the conversation. I understand it's a challenge to come up with an ad lib like that, but it's really good that you can do that, because yeah, taking personal responsibility for yourself and for how things impact and affect you is really important. Like, you don't, just because you get ousted from punk band doesn't mean you have to stop making music. Just because
Yeah.
certain people don't gather and understand, I would say, a more accurate map of reality doesn't mean you have to continue associating closely with them. You can find more like-minded people here and elsewhere. Here we are, literally on virtually the antipode, the exact polar, like global opposite places. You know, I'm in Hawaii. Technically, the antipode is Botswana. Botswana is just a little bit north of where you are, technically
Right.
speaking.
Yeah.
You know, the distance doesn't change it. Somehow you found me. Like, I'm going to take a guess. The Facebook feeds just sort of threw me over to you, and you liked my posts a bit. Is that kind of it?
Well, that's what happened, because well, in terms of that, I mean, the social media stuff. I've made friends with a lot of people from that were connected to What on Earth is Happening, and the one great work of Mark Bassio's, right? And what happened was that I just started making friends with them, because I, within my circles, I needed support. You know what I mean? Because there was no one else that was posting the stuff that I was posting, and I needed memes. So, and that's how I came across your memes. So yeah, they resonated with me. So that's why.
Perfect. And yeah, I'm just a curator. I'm not I've not really created more than a couple on my own. I just find that there's such abundance of good visual images mixed with words, and that's all I have to do is just curate that and put them out there, and then spark some good I would say just try to spark some good conversation. Like, that's what this has been. And it's been really great talking with you. I really am, again, I'm grateful for your time, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Daryl. There's so much to talk about still in terms of these subjects. I'd love to cover some more of this, but I hope that I was eloquent, and thank you very much for having me on.
You got it. Thank you.
Made you think.